The man didn't even look up from his ledger when he said it. He just kept running his finger down the column of numbers, his voice flat and bored, as if he were discussing the price of feed grain rather than a human being standing 3 feet in front of him. "We don't hire women built like you," said Gerald Pruitt, owner of the Silver Creek General Provisions, without lifting his eyes. "You'd eat through my profits before the week was out." The 2 men behind the counter laughed. One slapped the other on the shoulder. A woman near the dry goods shelf turned away, pretending she hadn't heard. Mabel Rosewood stood still. Her leather bag hung from her right hand. The strap had worn a permanent groove into her palm over the past 4 days of walking and hitching rides on supply wagons across the Texas flatlands. She had 43 cents in the pocket of her dress. She had not eaten since yesterday morning. She did not cry. She had used up most of her tears somewhere back in Louisiana, in the ash and smoke of a life that no longer existed. She set her bag down on the floorboards, straightened her back, and looked Gerald Pruitt directly in the face until he finally had to meet her eyes. "Thank you for your time," she said. Then she picked up her bag and walked out into the heat. If you've ever stood in a doorway and felt the whole world tell you that you didn't belong, stay with me. Because this is the story of a woman who walked through every door that was slammed in her face and what she built on the other side. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end. You will not want to miss what comes next. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let me take you back to where it all began. Silver Creek, Texas, in the summer of 1883, was not a town that forgave weakness. The heat came down like judgment, pressing everything flat and dry. The streets were unpaved and cracked, the storefronts sun-bleached to the color of old bone. The people who survived there had made a private agreement with hardship. They would not complain about it, and it would not kill them outright. Most of them kept that bargain. Mabel had arrived 2 days earlier on a supply wagon driven by a taciturn old man named Earl, who'd said exactly 11 words to her over the course of a 40-mile ride. She hadn't minded. She was used to silence by then. Silence, and the particular quality of attention that her body seemed to draw in strangers. The quick glance, the second look, the slow assessment that began at her feet and traveled upward and landed always on the same conclusion. She was a large woman, not large in the soft, comfortable way that people sometimes described with gentleness. She was solidly, substantially large, with broad shoulders and heavy arms, and a frame that had been built for endurance rather than decoration. She knew what people saw when they looked at her. She had known it since she was 12 years old, and a boy at school had made a joke that the other children thought was clever. She had learned, over the years, to see the joke coming before anyone told it. She had also learned that knowing it was coming didn't make it land any softer. What the people of Silver Creek did not know, what Gerald Pruitt with his ledger and his lazy cruelty could not have guessed, was that Mabel Rosewood had survived things that would have dismantled most people entirely. She had built something real and meaningful once, in a life that felt like it belonged to someone else now. And she had lost it in one night, in fire and smoke, and the particular silence that falls after everything loud has ended. She was not looking for sympathy. She was looking for work. The problem was that Silver Creek in the summer of 1883 was not a place that offered much of either. She had tried the hotel first, the morning after she arrived. The woman at the desk, a sharp-featured redhead named Mrs. Calloway, had looked her over with the careful eye of someone pricing livestock. "We had a girl last spring," Mrs. Calloway said. "Didn't work out." "I'm not a girl," Mabel said. "I'm 34 years old, and I can clean a room properly and manage laundry and do whatever else the position requires. The position requires someone who can move quickly up and down stairs. Guests don't like waiting." "I move fine." Mrs. Calloway had pressed her lips together in a way that made her opinion clear without committing to it in words. "I'll let you know if something opens up," she said, and looked back down at her papers. Something would not open up. Mabel understood that before she reached the door. She tried the feed store, the livery, the seamstress on the corner of Main and Calhoun, who had a handwritten sign in her window that said, "Help Wanted." The seamstress, a German woman named Helga Brenner, who spoke English with careful precision, had seemed almost interested for a moment, right up until she learned that Mabel had no fixed address in town. I cannot pay someone I cannot find, Helga said. It was not cruel. It was just the arithmetic of a small business run on thin margins. Mabel understood arithmetic. She thanked her and moved on. The general provisions had been her fourth attempt in 2 days. She had gone there last, partly because she needed to spend some of her 43 cents on food, and partly because she'd heard that Gerald Pruitt sometimes needed stockroom help. What she had not expected, though perhaps she should have by that point in her life, was the particular caliber of his dismissal. Most people found ways to say no that allowed everyone to preserve a small fiction of dignity. Gerald Pruitt had not bothered. She stood outside on the boardwalk after she left his store and let the heat press down on her and thought about what she was going to do. She had enough money for one more night at the boarding house on Elm Street if Mrs. Tuttle didn't raise her rate again. After that, she was not sure. She had walked into Silver Creek with 43 cents and a leather bag and a photograph and the skills she'd spent her whole life building, and she was starting to understand that skills required someone willing to see them before they were worth anything at all. She was standing there, running the numbers in her head, when she heard the conversation happening on the other side of the dry goods barrels stacked against the wall of the provisions. 2 men. Their voices were rough and unhurried, the voices of men who worked outdoors and were not in any particular hurry to get back to it. "Blackwood's in a bad spot," one said. "What kind of bad spot?" "His cook quit. Took off 3 days ago, middle of the night, no notice, no nothing. Man's got 22 cowboys to feed 3 times a day, and not one of them can boil water without burning the pot." The second man made a sound that might have been sympathy or might have been amusement. "What's he going to do?" "Hell if I know. Heard he sent word into town looking for someone. But who's going to ride out to Blackwood's place in this heat for a cook's wage?" Mabel picked up her bag. She walked around the corner of the building and looked at the 2 men, who startled slightly, and then looked back at her with the expression she'd grown accustomed to. "Blackwood Ranch," she said. "Which direction?" Sen. The older of the 2 men, a wiry fellow with a sun-dried face and kind enough eyes, had told her it was about 8 miles northeast, following the creek road. He'd said it in a way that suggested he thought she was asking out of curiosity rather than intention. When she thanked him and started walking, he called after her. "Ma'am, it's 8 miles, in July." "I'm aware of the month," she said, and kept walking. She heard him say something to his companion, but she didn't look back to catch the words. She had learned that too. That looking back was rarely useful. The creek road was exactly as advertised, a rutted track that followed the thin line of willows marking the presence of water, if not the abundance of it. The creek itself was low, running sluggish and warm between banks of cracked mud. Mabel stopped twice to rest in the shade and once to refill the small tin canteen she carried, which the creek water did not improve, but which at least addressed the most immediate problem. She thought about her mother while she walked. This was not unusual. She thought about her mother often, in the way you think about someone who taught you the things that turned out to matter most. Celestine Rosewood had been a compact, fierce woman from New Orleans who had built a restaurant out of almost nothing over the course of 15 years. Not a grand establishment, not a place that attracted wealthy clientele or drew praise from traveling journalists, but a real place. A place where people came back because the food was honest and the welcome was genuine, and something about the experience of sitting at one of Celestine's tables made you feel, for an hour, that the world was not as indifferent as it usually appeared. Mabel had grown up in that kitchen. She had learned to cook not from recipes but from watching, from repetition, from the particular way her mother's hands moved when she was doing something she'd done 10,000 times and knew in her body rather than her mind. She had learned that food was not decoration or fuel. It was the medium through which people communicated care. That the act of cooking well for someone was one of the most direct ways a person could say, "You matter. I see you. Sit down." She had been 26 when the fire started. They never determined the exact cause. A lamp, a coal from the stove, dry wood that had been dry for too long. It had moved fast. Kitchen fires always did. Her mother had not made it out. Mabel had spent the 8 years since that night doing what she could to keep moving. She had worked in other kitchens, in other towns, when she could find the work. She had been turned away from more positions than she could count, for reasons that ranged from the practical to the shameless. She had lived in boarding houses and spare rooms, and once, for 3 weeks in the worst winter she could remember, in the back of a dry goods wagon belonging to a family named Aldrich, who were traveling west and didn't charge her rent in exchange for cooking their meals. She had kept going because stopping was not in her nature, because her mother had not raised her to stop, and because somewhere under the exhaustion and the accumulated weight of being told, over and over, that she was not what anyone was looking for, there was a part of Mabel Rosewood that was constitutionally incapable of believing it. She smelled the ranch before she saw it, cattle and dust and something underneath that, hay drying in the sun, the faint mineral bite of well water. The road curved around a stand of scrub oak, and then the buildings came into view. A main house, substantial and practical, built from good timber with a covered porch running the length of the front. A bunkhouse behind it. Stables. A cookhouse set a little apart from the main structures, its chimney cold. There were men moving around the property, going about afternoon work with the particular economy of motion that came from doing the same things every day for years. 2 of them noticed her approaching at the same time and stopped what they were doing. She was aware of the attention, the same way she was always aware of it, like a weather system moving in. And she kept her pace steady and her face neutral and walked toward the main house. She was on the porch steps when the door opened. Ethan Blackwood was not what she'd expected, though she hadn't had a clear expectation. He was perhaps 40, perhaps a few years past it, with the build of a man who had done physical work for most of his life and hadn't stopped. His face was weathered in the specific way of men who spent their days outdoors, the skin drawn tight across the angles of his jaw and forehead, the lines around his eyes deeply set. He was not an unkind-looking man. He was also not, at the moment, a particularly welcoming one. He looked at her the way people usually did. Then he looked at her bag, then back at her face. "Help you?" he said. "I heard you're looking for a cook," Mabel said. Something moved across his face. Not quite amusement, but something adjacent to it. "Word travels. I was in town." He came out onto the porch and crossed his arms, looking at her with the direct assessment of a man who was used to making quick decisions about things and people and who had learned, probably through expensive errors, to look carefully before deciding. "You cook professionally?" "I grew up cooking professionally. My family had a restaurant in New Orleans for 15 years. I've been working in commercial kitchens since I was 12 years old. What happened to the restaurant?" "It burned down." He waited to see if there was more. She didn't offer more. He let the silence sit for a moment and then said, "Ranch cooking is different from restaurant cooking. I've got 22 men who work hard and eat like it. 3 meals a day, every day, no exceptions. The work starts before sunrise, and the kitchen's the last thing that shuts down at night. I understand. The last cook I had, a man named Dobbins, couldn't handle the pace, left without notice. I won't do that. You don't know that yet." He said it simply, without meanness. It was actually the most honest thing anyone had said to her in a week, and she felt something shift slightly in her assessment of him. "You're right," she said. "I don't. But you don't know whether I can do the job either, so we're both operating on incomplete information." He looked at her for a moment longer. Behind him, through the open door, she could hear the sound of the house, floorboards settling, the distant clatter of something in a back room. "What's your name?" "Mabel Rosewood." "Mrs. Rosewood?" "Miss?" He nodded once, as if filing this information away. "Ethan Blackwood. This is my ranch." He said it without grandiosity, just a statement of fact, establishing the coordinates. "I'll be straight with you, Miss Rosewood. I've had 3 people come out here in the last 2 days looking for this position. One was a boy of about 15 who'd never cooked anything more complicated than a fried egg. One was a woman from town who took one look at the cookhouse and decided she'd rather not. And one was a man who came with a letter of recommendation from a restaurant in San Antonio that I later found out closed 6 months ago for health violations." "And now there's me," Mabel said. "And now there's you." He looked out past her at the property, and for a moment something moved through his expression that she couldn't quite name. "I've got 22 hungry men and cold stoves. What would you do with that?" "Give me the kitchen for this evening," she said. "One dinner. If the men won't eat it, I'll leave in the morning and you won't owe me a thing." He studied her face. She held steady under it. "That's a bold offer," he said. It's a fair one. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was going to say no. Then he stepped back and held the door open. Cookhouse is around the back, he said. I'll show you what we've got. The cookhouse was a long, low-ceilinged building with 2 wood-burning stoves, a central work table scarred by years of use, shelves of dry goods along one wall, and a cold cellar accessible through a trapdoor in the floor. Ethan opened it and gestured at the inventory with the expression of a man presenting evidence in a court case. Whatever Dobbins didn't use is what's left, he said. I haven't had time to put in a new order. Mabel set her bag down and walked slowly through the space, looking. She opened the cold cellar and went down 5 steps and stood in the relative cool taking stock of what was there. She came back up. She looked at the dry goods, sacks of flour, cornmeal, dried beans, salt, a tin of lard that was 3/4 full, onions hung in braids from a ceiling hook, potatoes in a burlap sack that were starting to push their eyes but were still good, a half-wheel of hard cheese wrapped in cloth, dried red peppers, a small crock of molasses. In the cold cellar, 2 large cuts of beef that were fresh enough, a side of salt pork, several dozen eggs in a ceramic bowl, a crock of rendered beef fat, and a small wheel of something that turned out to be decent cheddar. She ran the inventory in her head the way her mother had taught her. Not as individual ingredients, but as relationships. What went with what? What could be built and what could be achieved, and what the food could be made to say if she paid attention to it correctly. When do the men usually eat supper? She asked. Sundown, about 2 hours from now. And how many? 22, plus myself, if there's enough. She looked at the stoves. These draw well? They did when Dobbins was using them. I can't speak for them since. She opened the damper on the nearer stove and checked the flue, bent down and looked at the firebox, stood up and nodded once. I'll need wood, she said. Ethan looked at her for a moment. Then he went to the door and called across the yard to a young man who was passing with a bucket. Clint, bring a cord of wood to the cookhouse. He turned back. She was already rolling up her sleeves. You're not going to ask me what you're making, he said. You don't need to know what you're making before you start, she said. You need to know what you have and what you're trying to do. The rest follows. He watched her for a moment longer. Then he said, Supper's at sundown, and left. She worked. There was a particular quality to it, the work of cooking for many people under pressure, that she had not felt in years. It was not pleasant exactly, not at first. It was the opposite of pleasant. It was physical and demanding and hot, and required her to track several things simultaneously while keeping her hands doing something else entirely. And the stoves were unfamiliar, and one of them ran hotter than the other in a way she had to compensate for by feel. And the firewood that Clint brought was slightly too green and didn't want to catch, and she had to spend 15 minutes. She didn't have coaxing it. But underneath all of that, under the difficulty of it, there was something else. Something she had not realized she'd been missing until it came back. She was in a kitchen. She had ingredients, and she had fire, and she had a purpose that was immediate and concrete and measurable. 2 hours, 22 men, do the thing. She started the beans first because they needed the most time. Dried pintos into a heavy pot with water and a piece of salt pork and 3 of the onions, quartered, and a handful of dried red pepper, and she got the pot going and moved on. She cut the beef into generous pieces and seared them in the cast iron skillet in batches with the rendered fat until the outside was properly browned, building a crust that would hold up through braising, and then she built the braise in the large pot, the seared beef, more onions now diced fine, the molasses cut with a little of the apple cider vinegar she'd found on the back shelf behind a tin of baking powder, a bundle of dried thyme from the small ceramic jar she'd discovered near the salt. Water to cover. She got that going and turned her attention to the biscuits, her mother's biscuits. She had made them so many times that the motion of her hands cutting the cold fat into the flour was something she did not have to think about. Her hands knew it. Her palms knew the texture it needed to reach before you added the liquid. Her wrists knew the folding motion that created the layers without overworking the dough. She made 6 pans of biscuits. The potatoes she cut and parceled and set to roast in the oven with the beef fat and salt, and what rosemary she could find, which was not much but was enough to make the smell of them do what she needed it to do. The cheese she sliced thin for the table. The eggs she hard-boiled and then deviled with a mixture of the rendered fat and a dash of the apple cider vinegar and salt and pepper, pressing the filling back in with a spoon until they looked right. She was not making anything fancy. She was making things that tasted like someone had cared about making them. There was a difference, and it was not a small one. The young man, Clint, appeared in the cookhouse door about 45 minutes before sundown. He was perhaps 19, with the face of someone who hadn't quite grown into his nose yet, and he looked at the activity in the cookhouse with an expression of cautious surprise. "Mr. Blackwood sent me to set up the dining table," he said. "Good," Mabel said, without looking up from what she was doing. "You'll need extra plates. There's more food than Dobbins usually made." Clint hesitated. "How do you know what Dobbins usually made?" "Because I can see from the wear on this kitchen what got used regularly and what didn't," she said. "He didn't use the braising pot. He used the 2 fry pans. That tells me he was feeding these men fried things, which means they haven't had a proper braise since he took the job, however long ago that was." Clint stared at her. Then he went to set up the table. Plosham. They came in at sundown the way men do when they've been working since before dawn, tired and hungry in that specific bone-deep way that leaves no room for small talk, moving to their usual seats by habit, boots scraping on the plank floor. Mabel heard them from the cookhouse. She heard the sounds that meant they had registered that something was different. A pause. A murmur. The quality of silence that occurs when smell arrives before explanation. She brought the food out herself. She could have had Clint help, and she would need help on ordinary nights. She understood that already. But tonight she wanted to see them. She wanted to know what she was dealing with. They were a varied group, young men and older ones, a few with the look of men who'd come a long way from wherever they started, 2 who spoke to each other in Spanish and went quiet when she approached, a large red-headed man at the far end of the table who watched her the way a dog watches something it hasn't categorized yet, a wiry older man near the middle who had kind eyes and the weathered patience of someone who'd been working ranches for 30 years. She set the braised beef on the table in the heavy pot. She set the biscuits, 6 pans of them, golden on top and steaming. She set the potatoes, the beans, the deviled eggs down the center of the table. Then she stood back and let them look at it. The red-headed man at the far end said something under his breath to the man beside him. She heard the word heavy and knew what he meant by it, not the food. Nobody moved for a moment. Then the older man with the kind eyes reached forward, without ceremony, and took a piece of the beef. He put it in his mouth. He chewed. He swallowed. He looked down at his plate. "Lord Almighty," he said quietly, which was not a religious invocation so much as a response to something unexpected happening in his body. The man next to him reached for the pot. After that, the sounds that filled the room were the sounds of people eating in earnest, not the perfunctory sounds of men fueling themselves, but something different, slower, with pauses in the conversation that were not empty but full, the pauses of people who are paying attention to something. Mabel stood near the door and watched. She saw the moment when the red-headed man at the end tasted the beef, and she saw his expression do something complicated and interesting. She saw 2 of the younger men exchange a look when they tried the biscuits. She saw the older man with the kind eyes take a second biscuit before he'd finished his first. Nobody sent anything back. Nobody left food on their plate. At the head of the table, Ethan Blackwood ate without speaking. He ate thoroughly. He did not look at Mabel, but once, about halfway through the meal, he glanced briefly in her direction and then back at his plate. When they had nearly finished, the red-headed man, his name, she would learn later, was Tom Greer, and he had been on the Blackwood payroll for 6 years and considered himself something of an authority on the natural order of things at the ranch, looked down the table toward where she was standing. "Who made those biscuits?" he said. Not entirely hostile, more like someone who had been expecting one thing and received another and wasn't sure how to account for it. "I did," Mabel said. He looked at her for a moment. He looked at the biscuit in his hand. He took another bite. He didn't say anything else. The wiry older man, whose name was Pete, and who had been watching the whole scene with the quiet enjoyment of someone watching a good hand of cards play out, caught Mabel's eye and gave her a small nod. It was not much, but it was something. She washed the dishes herself that night. She was not required to. That was not typically a cook's responsibility. But she did it because she needed to understand the space and its routines, and because the repetitive work of washing gave her somewhere to put the nervous energy that had accumulated over the course of the day. The cookhouse was quiet. The ranch had settled into its night sounds. The cattle distant and low, a horse moving in the stable, the creak of the bunkhouse cooling down from the day's heat. She was putting the last of the pots away when she heard footsteps on the cookhouse steps. Then Ethan Blackwood was in the doorway, his hat in his hand for the first time since she'd met him. "You didn't have to wash those," he said. "I know." He came a few steps in and looked at the clean kitchen, the pots on their hooks, the stoves banked for the night, the work table scrubbed down. Something in his face was doing the calculation she'd seen men do when they encountered something they hadn't prepared for. "They ate everything," he said. "I noticed. Tom Greer ate 4 biscuits. In the 8 years I've known that man, I have never seen him eat 4 of anything. They were good biscuits. I'm aware of that now." He looked at her steadily. "You could have told me you knew what you were doing." "I did," she said. "You just couldn't verify it until now." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a nightbird started up and then stopped. The lamp on the work table cast the room in the warm, slightly unsteady light that made everything look a little softer than it was. "The job pays $12 a month," he said. "Rooms in the main house, back bedroom off the kitchen. It's small, but it's private. Meals are included, obviously. I'll put in a supply order tomorrow for whatever you need to run the kitchen properly." She looked at him. "You want to keep me on?" she said. It was not quite a question. "I'd be a fool not to," he said. "And I've been called many things in this county, but not usually that." She had expected to feel relief. What she felt instead was something more complicated. The particular weight of a thing you've been working toward for a long time finally arriving and turning out to be real rather than a thing you were hoping for. It had texture. It had mass. "I'll need full authority over the kitchen," she said. "What's served and when and how it's prepared. I don't cook by committee." "Fine. And if someone has a complaint, they bring it to me directly, not to you and then to me." He looked at her with something that might have been the beginning of appreciation. "Also fine. Then I'll stay," she said. He put his hat back on. "Breakfast is at 5:30, he said. "Men need to be working by first light." He paused at the door. "Welcome to Blackwood Ranch, Miss Rosewood." She nodded. He left. She stood for a moment in the clean kitchen, in the lamplight, with the night sounds of the ranch coming through the walls. She thought about her mother. She thought about the restaurant on Sharch Street that no longer existed. She thought about all the doors she'd stood in front of in the past 8 years, and the particular texture of being turned away from each of them. Then she picked up her bag, found the back bedroom that was small and private and smelled faintly of cedar, and went to sleep. Tomorrow started at 5:30. She had work to do. She was up at 4:15. Not because she had to be. 5:30 was the deadline, not the starting gun, but because she had always worked this way. The hour before the kitchen was fully operational was the hour that determined everything that came after. You used it to think, to plan, to stand in a space that was about to become loud and demanding and get quiet with it first. She lit the lamp and stood at the work table in the dark cookhouse and ran through what she had. The supply inventory she'd taken the night before was still clear in her head. The dry goods were adequate, but not generous. The cold cellar had enough for breakfast if she was thoughtful about it. She would need Ethan to put that supply order in early, because by the end of the week she was going to be stretching things in ways that produced adequate food rather than good food, and she had already decided that adequate was not what she was here to make. She started the stoves while the sky outside was still the deep blue that comes just before the black starts loosening. The green wood from the night before had dried enough overnight that it caught better now, and she had both fireboxes going within 20 minutes, the heat building slowly toward working temperature. She put water on for coffee, a large pot, the largest she had, because 22 men going to work in the Texas summer needed coffee the way machinery needed oil. And then she started on the biscuits. She had made a decision the night before, lying in the cedar-scented bedroom, listening to the ranch settle around her, that she was not going to coast on last night. One good dinner was a proof of concept. It proved she could do the thing. What she needed to prove now, over the next several days, and then the several weeks after that, was that she could sustain it, that it wasn't a performance, that the kitchen would run the same way on a Tuesday morning as it had on a Monday evening when everything was new and she was trying to make an impression. The biscuits this morning were the same biscuits, same flour, same ratio of fat to flour, same folding motion, same temperature in the oven. She made them the same way because the men needed to understand, without being told, that this was not a thing that had happened once and might not happen again. Reliability was its own kind of message. Clint was the first one through the cookhouse door at 10 minutes past 5. He came in the way young men do when they're not yet sure of their footing in a new situation, tentative, ready to adjust, watching for cues about how things were going to go. He stopped when he smelled the coffee and the biscuits and the eggs she had going in the iron skillet. "Morning," he said. "Plates are on the shelf," she said. "You can start setting up." He moved to do it without argument, which told her something useful about him. He was not the kind of young man who needed to establish his position before he would cooperate. That was rarer than people assumed. "How many eggs you want me to count for?" he asked. "All 22, and Mr. Blackwood, if he comes in. He usually eats in the house." "His choice," Mabel said. "But there'll be enough." The men came in over the next 15 minutes in ones and twos, the way they always did. The early risers first, the ones who had been awake since before 4 and had already done a circuit of the stock before breakfast, and then the slightly later ones who moved through the morning with the economical efficiency of people who had been doing this long enough that every motion was automatic. Tom Greer came in third to last. The way Mabel would come to understand was his habit. Not so late as to be inconsiderate, but late enough to signal that he was not eager. He was a man who managed his eagerness carefully. She was already learning. He came in and looked at the table and looked at the eggs, and then he looked at her with an expression that was not quite neutral. "Same cook as last night?" he said. "Same cook," she said. He sat down. He didn't say anything else, but he ate 2 full plates of eggs and 3 biscuits, and when he stood up to leave, he picked up his plate and carried it to the wash basin without being asked. She noticed that. She filed it away. A man who made a show of skepticism but carried his own plate when he thought no one was watching him was a man who was capable of changing his mind, even if he'd rather not admit it. The first week was difficult in the way that all first weeks are difficult. Not dramatically, not with obvious crises, but with the grinding difficulty of learning a new set of variables while simultaneously performing at a level that left no room for the learning curve to show. She learned the kitchen's rhythms by working through them. The left stove ran 10 degrees hotter than she'd initially estimated, not 8. She caught this on the second morning when the first pan of biscuits came out darker on the bottom than they should have, and she adjusted. The cold cellar had a drainage problem that caused one corner of it to pool slightly when the temperature differential was large enough, which meant she had to think carefully about what she stored where. The dry goods shelf had a mouse problem that she identified on day 3 when she found evidence in the cornmeal sack, and she went to Ethan that evening and told him she needed a cat. He looked at her across the porch in the way he had, direct, assessing, never quite what you'd call warm but not cold either, and said, "There's a barn cat, 3 of them actually. They need to start working in the cookhouse at night. They won't like that." "The mice like it less," she said. He had one of the barn cats relocated to the cookhouse that same evening. The mouse problem resolved itself within the week. The men she was learning more slowly, which was the right pace. She paid attention the way her mother had taught her to pay attention, not by asking questions, which put people on alert, but by watching how they moved through the space she controlled and listening to what they talked about when they forgot she was there. 22 men was a small world. It had its own internal politics, its own loyalties and frictions and histories. She was not going to understand all of it quickly, and she was not going to try. What she did understand by the end of the first week was this. The ranch had been unhappy for a while before she got there. Not dramatically unhappy. Not in the way that produces visible conflict or causes people to quit, but quietly, persistently unhappy in the way a house gets when something essential has been missing from it for a long time. The food had been part of it. Dobbins had been, by all accounts, she pieced together from overheard conversations and Clint's occasional unguarded commentary, a functional but joyless cook. He'd produced food that kept men fed and not much else. But the food was only a symptom. She had cooked long enough to know that. On the 8th day, something happened that she had not anticipated. She was in the middle of the lunch preparation. A pot of beef soup that she'd been building since early morning. The bones roasted first and then simmered long enough that the broth had gone amber and dense, with vegetables added in sequence according to how long each needed, when she heard raised voices from the direction of the bunkhouse. She did not go to look. It was not her concern. 30 minutes later, Clint appeared in the cookhouse doorway with a cut on his lip and the careful expression of someone managing more pain than he was showing. She looked at him. She looked at the cut. She went to the shelf where she kept the small medical kit she'd asked Ethan for on day 2 and came back with a clean cloth and the bottle of witch hazel. "Sit," she said. "It's nothing," he said. "Sit," she said again, in the tone her mother used to use, which left no interpretive room. He sat. She cleaned the cut without ceremony, the way you clean a thing that needs cleaning. He flinched once and held still after that. "Tom Greer?" she said. He was quiet for a beat too long. "It was a disagreement," he said. "Between you and Tom Greer." "It was—" He stopped, started again. "He said something I didn't appreciate." "About what?" Another pause. She waited, pressing the cloth gently against the cut. "About you," Clint finally said. "He said something about you, and I told him he was wrong, and it went from there." She sat back and looked at him. He was looking at the floor with the expression of someone who has just admitted more than he intended to. "What did he say?" she asked. "It doesn't bear repeating." "Tell me anyway." He looked up. His face was doing several things at once, none of them simple. "He said you'd be gone inside a month, that women like you," he said it that way, "women like you, don't last in places like this. That you made one good meal and everyone's acting like it's something special, but it's not. It's just food. And you'll realize soon enough that this life isn't for everyone, and then you'll be gone and we'll be back to the same situation." Mabel looked at him for a long moment. "Did he say anything else?" Clint's jaw tightened. "Nothing I'm going to repeat." She nodded once. She put the witch hazel away and folded the cloth. She stood up and looked at the soup, which was doing exactly what it needed to be doing, and she gave it a slow stir and adjusted the heat slightly. "Thank you for defending me," she said, without turning around. "He was wrong." "Maybe," she said, "but you didn't need to fight him over it. If he wants to think I'll be gone in a month, let him think it. In a month he'll know he was wrong, and that's going to mean more than anything you could have said this afternoon." Clint was quiet behind her. She heard him shift in the chair. "You're not upset?" he said. "I've heard worse things than that said about me, and I'm still here," she said. "Soup's ready in an hour. Go wash your face." She did not seek out Tom Greer. She understood the temptation to confront, to make her position clear, to establish in direct terms that she was not going anywhere, and that his opinion of her was something she'd already priced in and found manageable. It would have felt satisfying in the short term. It also would have been exactly the wrong move. What she did instead was cook. She cooked the soup that afternoon, and it was, as it had been building toward being all morning, the kind of soup that makes you stop talking when you taste it. Not because it was showy. There was nothing showy about it, but because it was dense with time and care, and you could taste both of those things in it, and people, even people who couldn't have articulated it, responded to that without quite knowing why. Tom Greer ate 2 bowls. She saw him do it from the doorway. He did not look in her direction. She went back to the kitchen. This was how it was going to work, she understood. Not with a confrontation, not with a speech, not with anyone acknowledging out loud that something was shifting. It was going to work the way most real things worked. Slowly, through accumulated evidence, through the daily repetition of doing the thing well, until the thing was simply what it was, and there was no longer any argument to be had about it. Her mother had taught her that too. Odd. On the 12th day, Ethan Blackwood came into the cookhouse at an odd hour. It was mid-afternoon, well past lunch, and too early for supper preparation to be underway in earnest. Mabel was at the work table doing two things at once, rendering a batch of beef fat she'd been saving and going through the supply order list she'd built up over the past week. She heard the steps on the porch and looked up, and he was in the doorway with his hat in his hand again, which she had come to recognize as something he did when he was about to say something he wasn't entirely sure about. "You have a minute?" he said. "I have several," she said. "The fat doesn't need watching." He came in and stood on the other side of the work table, and she had the slight odd sensation of looking at a man who was more comfortable giving orders in his own space than having a conversation in it. He looked at the supply list. "This is detailed," he said. "I know what the kitchen needs to run properly for the next 3 weeks," she said. "I also flagged a few things that would improve the quality if the budget allows. They're marked separately." He looked at the list more carefully. He had the reading posture of someone who was used to paperwork. Ranch accounts, she assumed, land records, the endless documentation that a large operation required. He was not a man who was uncomfortable with paper. "Dutch cocoa," he said. "For a pudding. It's not essential." "The men don't get dessert?" "They didn't used to," she said. "That doesn't mean it can't change." He looked at her over the list. She looked back at him evenly. "Dessert costs money," he said. "So does turnover," she said. "Happy men stay. Unhappy men start looking for reasons to leave. A pan of chocolate pudding once a week costs less than recruiting and training a replacement." He was quiet for a moment. She couldn't read his face entirely. She'd been trying to learn it over the past 12 days, and she had some of it, but not all. He kept things back in a way that was habitual rather than calculated, as if he'd simply learned over the years that showing less was the safer approach. "You've thought about this more than I expected," he said. "I think about things more than people expect generally," she said. "It's one of the advantages of being underestimated." Something crossed his face, not quite a smile. He wasn't, she was beginning to understand, a man who smiled easily, but something adjacent to it, something that indicated the remark had landed. "The Dutch cocoa stays on the list," he said. He set the paper back on the table. "I wanted to talk to you about something else." She waited. "I'm having 3 men from the county come out on Saturday," he said, "for a dinner meeting, business matters. I need the meal to be different from the regular ranch supper. Not elaborate, but better presented, more deliberate." She considered this. "How many dishes?" "Whatever's appropriate." "I don't know what's appropriate. That's why I'm asking you." "What kind of business?" He paused, and she could see him deciding how much context to give. "Land dispute. 2 of the men are on my side of it. 1 is not. I need the evening to be civil, and I need everyone at that table to understand, but without me saying it directly, that Blackwood Ranch is a serious operation run by a serious person." She understood what he was asking. It was the thing she'd understood about food since she was a child, watching her mother run a restaurant. That a meal was never only a meal. It was a statement. It was a context. It was the shape of the room you built around a conversation. "I'll need a day's notice on the final count," she said, "and access to whatever you have in the way of serving pieces. I saw a cabinet in the dining room when I came through. The good china, the larger plates." "Those were my wife's," he said. He said it flatly, without effect, in the way people sometimes say things they've trained themselves to say without expression, because expression costs too much. She filed it carefully and did not pursue it. "I'll take care with them," she said. He nodded. He started toward the door, then stopped, turned back. "The men have been different this past week," he said. "In the evenings. Quieter, but not the bad kind of quiet. I don't know if you've noticed." She had noticed. She had been tracking it since day 4, the way the atmosphere in the dining room had begun to shift, from the distracted, slightly bleak efficiency of men eating because they had to something that moved more slowly. Men who lingered a few minutes after the meal was done. Men who talked to each other more and differently. "Food does that," she said, "when it's right." He looked at her for a moment that stretched a half-second longer than necessary. "I'm beginning to understand that," he said. Then he left. The Saturday dinner was the kind of test she had not been given fair warning for, which was fine. She had spent most of her life operating without fair warning. The three men arrived in mid-afternoon, and she heard them through the cookhouse wall, their voices, the sounds of introductions, the particular register of men doing business while performing social courtesy. She did not try to distinguish their words. She had work to do. She had prepared the menu over 2 days. Not elaborate. Ethan had been right about that, and she trusted his read of the room better than she trusted her own in this instance. A clear consommé to start, which required more labor than anyone at the table would understand. 3 hours of careful skimming and straining to achieve a broth that looked simple but was not. A roasted beef tenderloin, which she'd had Ethan source specially from a ranch contact in the next county, prepared with a crust of dried herbs and rested properly before slicing. Roasted root vegetables. A sauce built from the roasting drippings and a splash of the good rye whiskey she'd found at the back of the pantry cabinet. Fresh bread. Not biscuits tonight, but a proper yeast bread she'd started the night before and had been managing all day. And for dessert, the Dutch cocoa pudding she'd been testing in smaller batches through the week, which was by now exactly right. She plated everything herself. She used the wife's good china with the care she'd promised, washing each piece by hand before service, checking each one for cracks by holding it to the lamp. There were no cracks. The china was very good, the kind that had been bought to last rather than to impress, and it was beautiful in the clean, undecorated way of things made to actually be used. Clint carried the courses out. She had coached him on the sequencing and the timing, and he was a quick study, nervous but focused, the way young men are when they understand that something matters and want to get it right. She listened to the sounds from the dining room through the wall, the way she'd done in her mother's restaurant 100 times. You couldn't hear words clearly, but you could hear the quality of the room. You could hear when a silence was the silence of men thinking versus the silence of men who were uncomfortable. You could hear the shift in register that meant a conversation had reached something real. What she heard, over the course of 2 hours, was a dinner that went well. She couldn't have explained it more precisely than that. It went well. The silences were the right kind. The voices, when she could catch their tone through the wall, had the quality of men who had been disarmed by something and were operating in that unexpected good faith. After the men left, Ethan came to the cookhouse. It was late, nearly 10, and Mabel was finishing the last of the washing up, the good china done first, and set carefully to dry on clean towels. He stood in the door for a moment. "The dinner was good," he said. "I know," she said. A short sound from him. Surprised, she thought, but not annoyed. "You're not modest." "I'm accurate," she said. "There's a difference." He came a few steps in. He looked at the china drying on the towels, and something moved through his expression. Something she now understood was connected to the wife, to whatever that history was, though she did not have the details and did not reach for them. Victor Kane, the man on the other side of the land dispute, said something before he left, Ethan said. He said this was a finer evening than he'd expected. Did that help you? It gave the conversation a different quality than these things usually have. He paused. He's not an easy man to deal with, but people are different at a good table. You soften things you wouldn't otherwise soften. That's the whole point, Mabel said. He looked at her. The lamp was low and the cookhouse was warm from the day's work still held in the walls, and the quality of the light made everything look softer than it was, the shadows falling in ways that smoothed out the rough textures of the room. Where did you learn all this? He said. Not just the cooking, the thinking about it. She dried her hands on the cloth and set it down. She considered the question not because she didn't know the answer, but because the answer was one she hadn't spoken out loud in a long time, and she wanted to find the right entry point into it. My mother, she said. She built something from nothing in New Orleans, a real place. People came from across the city. She didn't have money when she started, and she didn't have connections. She had skill, and she had patience, and she understood what she was really selling, which was never the food. What was it? Mabel looked at the clean china on the towels. The feeling that someone had thought about you before you arrived, she said. That's what people pay for when they pay for a good meal, not the ingredients. The evidence that someone cared enough to think. Ethan was quiet for a moment that had a different quality than his usual silences. This one felt less like management and more like actual stillness. "She sounds like she was remarkable," he said. "She was," Mabel said simply. He asked nothing else about it, and she was grateful for that. He had a quality she was still getting used to, the ability to recognize when a door had opened and not try to walk through it uninvited. "Thank you for tonight," he said. "The whole of it." "It's the job," she said. "It's more than the job," he said, and left. She stood in the quiet cookhouse for a while after he was gone. Outside, the ranch made its night sounds. The cattle, the horses, the creak of the bunkhouse, the distant call of something in the brush. The lamp threw its small circle of warmth, and the shadows sat at the edges of it. She thought about her mother's hands, about the way the restaurant on Chartres Street had smelled on a Sunday morning before service. Coffee and the first hour of something slow cooking, clean floors, the sound of chairs being set around tables, the whole place holding its breath before the work began. It wasn't the same. She was not trying to make it the same, but it was something, and something, in her experience, was what you started with. She turned the lamp down and went to bed. 3 weeks in, and the ranch had begun to feel like a place she knew. Not home. She was careful not to use that word, even in her own thinking, because she had learned something about herself over the past 8 years that she trusted. She attached too quickly to places and not quickly enough to people, and that imbalance had cost her before. But she knew the cookhouse now the way you know a tool you've been using long enough that it stops feeling like something separate from your hand. She knew which floorboard creaked near the cold cellar door, and which stove needed an extra 10 minutes to come to full heat in the morning. She knew that the supply wagon from Silver Creek came on Thursdays, and that the driver, a heavy-set man named Bart, would accept a biscuit in lieu of extended conversation, which suited them both. She knew the men in the way that mattered for her work, not their full histories, not their private lives, but the things that showed up at the table. Pete Alderman, the wiry older cowhand who had been the first to reach for the beef that first night, took his coffee with no sugar and drank it before he ate anything, and he ate slowly and thoroughly and never left anything on his plate, which was the habit of a man who had been genuinely hungry at some point in his life and hadn't forgotten it. The two Spanish-speaking cowboys, brothers named Rafael and Domingo Vega, preferred their food with more heat than Mabel's standard preparations, and she had quietly started adding a second small dish of dried pepper paste to the end of the table nearest where they sat, without announcement, and had noticed the slight adjustment in their posture the first time they discovered it. Small things. The kind of attention that didn't require acknowledgement to work. Tom Greer she knew least well of all, which was strange because he was the most present, the loudest, the most opinionated, the one whose moods moved through the bunkhouse the way weather moved through a valley, affecting everything without quite being the thing itself. He ate well every meal. He had stopped making comments, at least within her hearing, about her suitability for the position. He carried his plate to the wash basin every time, without exception. These were the facts she had. What was underneath them, she had not yet determined. It was on a Wednesday morning, 23 days after she arrived, that everything shifted. She had been in the cold cellar when she heard the sound. Not a crash exactly, more a heavy thud, the kind made by something with significant mass meeting the floor with no preparation. She came up the cellar steps fast and found Pete Alderman in the cookhouse doorway, one hand on the frame, the color of old chalk. "It's Domingo," he said. "He's down." She moved past him without asking further questions. Domingo Vega was in the yard between the cookhouse and the bunkhouse, sitting against the side of the bunkhouse wall, with his legs straight in front of him and his right hand pressed flat against his upper arm. His shirt was dark with blood from mid-shoulder to the elbow. His brother Rafael was crouching beside him, speaking in fast, low Spanish, and a half-circle of men had formed at a useful distance, close enough to help, far enough not to crowd. Mabel went straight to Domingo. She knelt in the dirt without thinking about it. "Move your hand," she said. "It's all right," Domingo said. His voice was steady, which she noted, not in shock. "Good." "I'm sure it's fine," she said. "Move your hand." He moved it. The cut was long, but not deep. A fence wire, she learned later, that had snapped under tension and come back hard. It had opened the skin in a clean line about 5 inches long, bleeding freely, which looked alarming but was often better than bleeding that pooled. She pressed his hand back over it. "Keep pressure on that," she said. She looked at Raphael. "There's a clean cloth on the middle shelf in the cookhouse, and the brown bottle on the top shelf, right side." Raphael was on his feet before she finished the sentence. She stayed where she was, one hand over Domingo's to make sure the pressure didn't ease, and looked at his face while she waited. He was 26 or 27, she thought, with a face that was usually easy and expressive, and right now it was doing the thing faces do when a person is managing pain by staying very still. "Does anything else hurt?" she asked. When the wire came back, did it hit anywhere else? "Just the arm," he said. "Did you fall?" "A little." "Did you hit your head when you fell?" He thought about this with more care than she'd expected. "No," he said. "I put my hand out." "Good." Raphael came back with the cloth and the bottle. She cleaned and bound the wound with the efficiency of someone who had done this before, not with medical training, but with the practical knowledge of a woman who had spent years in kitchens where burns and cuts were ordinary occupational events. The binding was tight and even. Domingo watched her hands while she worked. "You've done this before," he said. "More times than I'd like," she said. When she was done, she sat back on her heels and looked at him. "You need to keep that elevated today. Don't use that arm for anything heavy. If it starts bleeding through the binding in the next hour, come get me immediately." "I have work." "You have one arm today," she said. "Use the other one for light work. The arm will wait." She heard a sound behind her and looked up. Tom Greer was standing at the edge of the small crowd, looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not warmth exactly, but something that was in the neighborhood of it. Something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, like a man revising a conclusion he'd already committed to, which was never a comfortable thing for anyone. She stood up, brushed the dirt from her knees, and went back to the cookhouse. Raphael came to find her that afternoon. He came to the cookhouse door and stood there in the careful way of someone who has something they want to say and is working out how to say it in a language that isn't their first. She looked up from the bread she was shaping and waited, giving him time. "Thank you," he said, "for Domingo." "He's all right," she said. "The cut was clean." "No." He shook his head slightly, looking for the words. "Not just today. The pepper sauce. At the end of the table." He paused. "We noticed. First time. We noticed." She went back to the bread. "I noticed you never touched the hot sauce Dobbins apparently kept in the kitchen," she said. "I figured that meant you didn't like his version, not that you didn't want any heat." Raphael was quiet for a moment. "Most people, they don't look at us that way." She considered how to respond to that. It was a thing that deserved a real answer rather than a polite one. "Most people look at what's in front of them and see what they expected to see," she said. "It's a habit. It doesn't require bad intent. It's just lazy, mostly." She paused. "I've had people look at me and see what they expected to see my whole life. I got tired of doing it to other people." He looked at her for a long moment. "You want to know how to say something," she said. It was not a question. She could see it in his face, the particular expression of someone holding a sentence. "My mother," he said, "she made, there's a sauce, red, with dried anchos and a little chocolate. Very slow. She made it for everything important." He stopped, started again. "I haven't had it since we left Sonora. 4 years. Mabel looked at him. She thought about what she had in the cold cellar, the dry goods shelf, the back of the spice cabinet. Dried anchos. She'd seen them. She'd been using the standard red peppers, but there were 3 strings of dried anchos hanging near the back of the shelf she'd cataloged as 4 later. "Ancho and chocolate," she said, "and garlic, cumin." She toasted everything first, very slow, everything slow. His English was becoming more fluid as the subject took hold of him. She said the secret was patience. You could not rush it. "Your mother sounds like she knew what she was doing." "She knew everything," he said simply, the way people talk about a source that is past tense and irrecoverable. Mabel nodded once. "I'll see what I can do," she said. He left. She went back to the bread and let the conversation settle into the back of her mind, where she kept the things that needed more time than the present moment allowed. It was that same evening after supper when Ethan came to find her. This was not unusual by now. He had developed a habit of stopping by the cookhouse in the last hour of the day, after the men had eaten and before full dark settled, and it had acquired over the past weeks the quality of something routine without either of them naming it as such. He came in and stood somewhere in the room, and they talked about the ranch or the supply order, or occasionally nothing much, and then he left and she finished closing up the kitchen. But tonight he came in and stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking, which was different, and she looked at him and saw that something had shifted in his face. Not urgency. He was too controlled for urgency to show cleanly on him, but something that wanted addressing. "What happened?" she said. "Word came from town this afternoon," he said. "Kane is moving faster than I expected on the land matter." She had not been involved in the land dispute beyond cooking the dinner where the initial conversation had happened. She had retained what she'd learned then. Victor Kane, man on the other side, the land in question somewhere to the northeast of the current ranch boundary. The dispute involving water rights on a creek tributary that fed the ranch's eastern pastures. "What kind of faster?" she said. He came into the kitchen and sat down at the work table. The first time she had seen him sit in the cookhouse, as opposed to stand in the doorway or stand just inside it. He set his hat on the table. "He's filed with the county," he said. "I knew he was going to file, but I expected another month. He's moved the timeline up." "What does that mean for you?" "It means I have 2 weeks instead of 6 to get my documentation in order and get a lawyer from San Antonio who knows water rights law up here for a site visit." He rubbed the back of his neck. "It means the next few weeks are going to be compressed." She looked at him. He was not a man who spoke about difficulty easily, she had come to understand. He managed things, and managing was how he expressed concern. To say out loud that something was compressed was, for him, something close to saying it was serious. "Is there anything I can do?" she said. He looked up at that. She had the sense he hadn't expected the question. "You're the cook?" he said. "I'm aware of that," she said. "I'm also an adult with a functioning mind who has been in this house for 3 weeks and can keep a confidence." He looked at her for a moment. Something passed through his expression that she couldn't quite track. "The creek runs along the property line," he said. "Kane is claiming that the tributary that feeds the eastern pastures was never part of the original land grant, that it was always on the Kane family side of the boundary, and my cattle using that water is encroachment. Is he right?" "No," Ethan said, "but I have to prove that, and proving it means finding the original survey documents from 1861, which I know exist because my father referenced them in his own records, but which I have not been able to locate in this house despite looking for them for the better part of a month." "Where have you looked?" He gestured vaguely at the house behind him. "The study, the filing cabinets, my father's correspondence boxes in the back room." "What does a survey document from 1861 look like?" He paused. "Like a map, hand-drawn with notation, probably on something like vellum or heavy paper, rolled or folded." She thought about this. "The back room," she said. "The one off the hallway near the pantry." He looked at her. "You've been in there?" "I walked through it the second day looking for additional storage," she said. "There's a trunk in the back left corner, under the spare blankets." He stared at her. "I didn't open the trunk," she said. "I had no reason to. I'm just telling you there's a trunk that hasn't been moved in a long time, based on the dust pattern. If your father was the kind of man who put important documents in a box and covered it with blankets to keep the rodents off the paper," Ethan was already on his feet. She heard him moving through the house. She heard the sound of a door opening, footsteps on floorboards, silence. Then, a few minutes later, footsteps returning. He came back into the cookhouse with something in his hand, a roll of heavy paper, slightly yellowed, tied with a piece of cord that had gone brittle with age. He set it on the work table and looked at it, and then looked at her. "How did you know?" he said. "I didn't know," she said. "I just paid attention to what was in the room." He untied the cord carefully. It snapped at the knot, too old to hold, and unrolled the paper slowly, pressing the edges down with his hands to keep it flat. It was a survey document. She could see that even without knowing how to read such things, the careful lines, the notation in faded ink, the boundary markers drawn with a draftsman's precision. He read it in silence. She watched his face and saw the moment he found what he was looking for. A slight release around his jaw, a quality of stillness that was different from his ordinary stillness. "It's here," he said. "All of it. The tributary is marked as part of the original Blackwood grant, the whole eastern boundary." He looked up. "This wins the case." She nodded. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not gratitude exactly, because gratitude was too simple for what was in his face. Something more like the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been helped to set it down without having asked. "Mabel," he said, and then stopped. It was the first time he had used her first name. He seemed to realize it at the same moment she did. "You're welcome," she said, before he could find whatever he was trying to say next. She was washing the supper things 2 evenings later when Tom Greer knocked on the cookhouse door frame. She had not had a direct conversation with Tom Greer in the 3 weeks she'd been at Blackwood Ranch. They had existed in the same space repeatedly, and he had eaten her food every day, and they had exchanged the necessary minimal communications that working in the same environment required, but nothing more than that. The fight with Clint 3 weeks ago had not been revisited by either party. She had maintained her position, that the best response to his skepticism was the daily evidence of her work, and she had continued doing exactly that. Now he was at her door at 8:30 in the evening, turning his hat in his hands in a way that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to the way Ethan turned his hat when he had something difficult to say. "Got a minute?" he said. "Dish towels on the hook if you want to help," she said. He blinked. Then, after a moment that she could see cost him something, he came in and took the dish towel off the hook and started drying the stack of plates she'd left on the drain board. They worked in silence for a minute. He was not bad at it. Efficient, the way people are when a task is below their interest, but they've decided to do it properly anyway. "I was wrong about you," he said. He said it at the plate in his hands, which was perhaps the only way he could say it. She kept washing. "What specifically were you wrong about?" He glanced at her sideways. "You know what?" "I'd rather hear you say it." Another small silence. He set one plate down and picked up another. "I said you wouldn't last. I said—" He stopped, restarted. "I said things I shouldn't have said. About you. To Clint. And to others." He dried the plate, set it on the stack. "I've been on this ranch for 6 years. I've seen a lot of people come through and not stay. Men and women both. And I made assumptions I shouldn't have made." She looked at him then, directly, because she wanted to see his face while she asked the next question. "Why does it bother you enough to come say something now? You could have just let it sit." He met her eyes. He had blue eyes, she noticed, paler than she'd expected, the kind that looked washed out in certain lights and piercing in others. He was a man somewhere in his middle 40s who had not had an easy life but had not been destroyed by it either. He had survived things the same way she had survived things, she thought. Not gracefully, not without damage, but through. "Because Domingo came to me this afternoon," he said. "He told me about the sauce you're going to make, his mother's recipe. He told me you sat and listened to him talk about his mother, and you figured out what he was describing from the ingredients, and you're going to try to make it." He paused. I haven't seen Domingo look like that in 4 years. He looked like a man who got something back he thought was gone." She didn't say anything. "That's not just cooking," Tom Greer said. I don't know what that is, but it's not just cooking." "No," she said. "It's not." He dried 2 more plates. She washed 2 more bowls. "I'm sorry," he said. He said it quietly, without preamble, the way an apology sounds when it's real rather than performed. "What I said was wrong, and it was mean. I knew it was mean when I said it, and I said it anyway." She considered this. She let the water drain from the basin and dried her hands. "I've heard meaner things said about me by people with better manners than you," she said. "At least you come and say it to my face." He looked at her, and something in the tight set of his face eased slightly. "That's a low bar." "Most of the bars in my life have been low," she said. "I'm used to stepping over them." He almost smiled. "It was a close thing." a twitch at the corner of his mouth that he controlled before it became anything definitive. But it was there. She filed it. "The pudding you made last week," he said, moving toward the door. "The chocolate one." "What about it?" "It was the best thing I've eaten since I don't know when." He stopped at the door. "I'm not going to say that again, so you should note it now." "Noted," she said. He left. She stood in the clean, quiet cookhouse and felt something shift in the architecture of the past 3 weeks. The way a structure feels different once the last necessary support is in place. Not finished. Nothing was finished. But something load-bearing had been dealt with, and the rest of the construction could proceed on a more honest foundation. The ancho sauce took her 3 attempts. The first was wrong, in a way she could diagnose but not immediately fix. The toasting of the dried chilies needed to be slower, the heat lower, because she was burning the outermost layer before the inner part of the chili had time to release its oils properly. She knew this after the first batch because the sauce had a slight bitterness at the finish that shouldn't have been there, and she took it apart in her mind the way her mother had taught her to take apart a dish that wasn't working, not by starting over from scratch, but by identifying the single point of failure and correcting it. The second attempt was better, but the chocolate was wrong. She'd added it too early, and it had cooked past its contribution, going flat rather than adding the depth it was supposed to add. She made notes on a scrap of paper in the margins of the supply list, which was how she kept her thinking organized, in the absence of a proper recipe book for this kind of improvisational reconstruction. The third attempt she made on a Sunday afternoon when the kitchen was otherwise quiet, working slowly and with full attention, letting the chilies toast until she could smell the transformation point, that specific moment when the oils released and the scent shifted from raw to something roasted and rounded and complex. She added the garlic and cumin to the dry pan for the last 2 minutes of the toasting. She built the sauce in stages, the way Raphael had described his mother building it. Nothing rushed, everything given time to become itself before the next thing was added. The chocolate went in near the end, in small pieces, stirred until it was absorbed. She tasted it. It was not his mother's sauce. She knew that before she tasted it. It could never be his mother's sauce, because his mother's hands had made that sauce and hands were not transferable. And the kitchen in Sonora where it was made 4 years ago and more was a completely different place with completely different variables than this cookhouse in Silver Creek, Texas. The sauce she had made was a translation, not a reproduction. It was her interpretation of something someone else had described, built from imperfect information and the best available ingredients. But it was good. It was genuinely, solidly good. She ladled it into a small crock and covered it. She served it that Sunday evening alongside the roasted chicken she'd made for supper, setting the crock at the table without explanation. She watched Raphael and Domingo from the corner of her eye. Saw Raphael reach for the crock with the slightly automatic gesture of someone going for something familiar, and then slow, and then stop. Saw him look at it more carefully, saw him take a small spoonful and taste it. He sat very still for a moment. Then he passed the crock to Domingo. She didn't watch what happened after that. She went back to the cookhouse and stood at the work table and let the sounds from the dining room come through the wall the way they always did. And she thought about her mother and about the restaurant on Chartres Street and about the particular responsibility of a kitchen, which was not to make food but to make people feel that they were somewhere worth being. It was half an hour later when Raphael appeared at the cookhouse door. His face had the undone quality of a man who has been moved by something and is not trying to hide it, which she respected. "It wasn't exactly like hers," he said. "I know," she said, "but it was—" He stopped. He was not going to find the word in English. She could see that. He put his hand flat on his chest briefly, which said more than the word would have anyway. "I'm glad," she said. He nodded once. He looked like he might say more, and then didn't, which was right. Some things don't need more words than they've already used. After he left, she sat down for the first time all day. Just sat in the cookhouse on the 3-legged stool near the cold stove, in the last of the evening light, and let herself be tired. Not the exhausted, defeated tired of the first days in Silver Creek when she'd stood outside Gerald Pruitt's store in the heat with 43 cents and no plan. A different kind of tired. The kind that comes from doing something that required all of you and doing it to the standard it deserved. She had been at Blackwood Ranch for 26 days. She was still there. And tomorrow there was breakfast to make. She got up off the stool, set the lamp for the morning, and went to bed. The survey document changed things faster than Mabel had anticipated. Within 4 days of Ethan finding it in the trunk under the blankets, the lawyer from San Antonio, a compact, precise man named Howard Fitch, who wore a good suit badly and carried a leather briefcase that was more organized than most people's entire offices, had arrived at Blackwood Ranch, reviewed the document, conducted a site visit of the eastern boundary, and declared the case substantially resolved in Ethan's favor before it had properly begun. Victor Kane's attorney, informed of the document's existence through the appropriate legal channels, went quiet in the way that attorneys go quiet when they understand the math has changed. Ethan told her this on a Thursday evening in the cookhouse, standing at the work table with his hat in his hand, and she could see in his face the particular relief of a man who had been braced for a long, expensive fight and has just been told he can stand down. He looked younger, not dramatically younger. He was not a man whose age sat lightly on him, but there was something less compressed around his eyes. Fitch says we'll have a formal resolution within the month, he said. Kane's people are already backing down. Good, she said. It wouldn't have moved this fast without the document. The document was always there, she said. You just needed to know where to look. He looked at her steadily. That's a generous way of putting it. It's an accurate one, she said. I only knew the trunk was there because I walked through the room. You were the one who knew what you were looking for. He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was deciding whether to say the thing he was thinking. She had learned this about him, that there was always a version of what he was thinking that he held back, not because it was dishonest, but because he was a man who had built walls around his interior life so long ago that taking them down required deliberate effort, and he wasn't always sure the effort was warranted. I want to do something for you, he said, to acknowledge what you did and what you've been doing generally in the last month. You pay me $12 a month, she said. That's the job. This is something else. She looked at him. What did you have in mind? He set his hat on the table. The cookhouse, he said. There are things it needs that I've been putting off because Dobbins never asked for them, and I never thought to offer. A second work table. Better shelving. The current shelves are too shallow for what you're storing. And there's a window on the south wall that should be a door, because the ventilation in here in summer is poor, and you've been working in more heat than you should have to. She looked at the south wall. She had thought about that window herself more than once, standing in the afternoon heat with both stoves running. A door would help, she said. I'll have it done by end of next week, he said. And the shelving. The second table will take longer. I need to get the lumber from town. She nodded. She was aware that this was not a small thing. Lumber cost money, labor cost time, and Ethan Blackwood was a man who was careful with both. She was also aware, in a way she was still getting used to, that she was being treated as someone whose comfort in her working space was worth the investment. Thank you, she said. He picked up his hat. I should have done it when you arrived, he said. The window situation alone. He shook his head slightly, a self-critical gesture she'd seen in him before. He held himself accountable in the quiet, personal way of someone who didn't need an audience for it. I managed, she said. I know you did, he said. That's not the point. He left, and she stood for a moment in the insufficiently ventilated cookhouse and felt something that she identified after a moment's inspection as being looked after. It was an unfamiliar sensation. She held it carefully, the way you hold something fragile that you're not entirely sure belongs to you. The second month at Blackwood Ranch was different from the first in ways that were difficult to name specifically, but were visible in aggregate. The men had settled into a relationship with the cookhouse that was no longer provisional. They came to meals with the ease of people who had stopped wondering whether the food was going to be good and had begun, instead, to have preferences about which version of a good thing they wanted. Pete Alderman had developed a particular attachment to her potato soup that he expressed through the medium of eating 2 full bowls of it every time she made it, and then sitting slightly longer at the table than usual, in the way of a man who is comfortable enough to be in no hurry. Clint, who had been assigned to help in the cookhouse 3 mornings a week, had turned out to have a genuine aptitude for the work. Not cooking particularly, but organization and management, the logistical side of feeding a large number of people efficiently. He had reorganized the dry goods shelf one morning without being asked, using a system so straightforward and practical that she had looked at it for a moment and then simply moved on, because there was nothing to improve. Even Tom Greer had arrived at something that, if not warmth, was at least reliable decency. He came to meals without commentary. He did his work in the spaces adjacent to hers, the ranch work that sometimes spilled into the cookhouse yard, the supply unloading on Thursdays, without the undertow of hostility she'd felt in the first weeks. She did not consider him a friend. She was not sure he considered anyone a friend, exactly. But he had demonstrated in the consistent, unglamorous way of daily behavior that he had meant what he said when he came to her and apologized, which was rarer than it should have been. She was not naive about any of it. She had been in enough situations where she felt she'd established herself only to have the ground shift without warning. She held the goodwill of the ranch the way she held most things, with appreciation and without dependence, because dependence on something external was a vulnerability she had learned, expensively, not to cultivate. What she had not anticipated was the conversation with Ethan that happened on a rain-soaked Tuesday afternoon in the 6th week, which changed the shape of everything that came after. The rain had come in fast from the northwest, the way summer storms did in that part of Texas. No particular warning, the sky going the color of a bruise in the space of 20 minutes, and then the rain hitting the roof of the cookhouse with a force that made ordinary conversation difficult. She had moved the afternoon's bread baking inside and closed all the shutters on the north side and was working in the close, warm air of a cookhouse sealed against weather. When Ethan came in from outside, thoroughly wet, pulling the door shut behind him against the wind, he stood dripping on the floorboards near the door. "I have dry towels," she said, "if you're willing to acknowledge you need them." "Where?" "Second shelf, right side." He got a towel and dried his face and hands and stood for a moment looking out the shutter slats at the rain coming down in gray sheets across the yard. The cattle had moved to the far side of the eastern pasture. She could just see them through the slats, a dark mass against the gray. "The Hendersons lost their barn last night," he said. She looked up. "Fire?" "Lightning. Started around midnight, burned through before anyone could do much. James Henderson got all the animals out, but the structure's gone." He was still looking out the shutters. "Wife and 3 kids." She thought about this. "Where are they?" "Staying with a cousin in town for now, but the cousin's house is small and it's not going to work past a few days." He turned from the shutters. "I'm going to offer them the use of the old foreman's house, the one on the north boundary. It's been empty since Morrison left 3 years ago. Needs work, but it's solid." She looked at him. "That's a generous thing to do." "It's a practical thing," he said, in the tone he used when deflecting something he didn't want to examine directly. "Henderson has grazing rights on 2 sections adjacent to mine. I need him operational by fall." "It's both," she said. He met her eyes briefly and then looked away, which was close to an acknowledgement. "I'd like to have them for dinner," he said. "When the house is ready. All of them? James, his wife, the children." She nodded. "How old are the children?" "Youngest is 4, I think. Maybe 5. I don't know the older ones." She thought about a 4-year-old at her table, which she had not had to think about before, and what that required in terms of the food. "When?" 10 days. 2 weeks. Whenever the house is ready for them." "I'll be ready," she said. He nodded. He was still standing near the door, not quite committing to being inside, in the way he sometimes stood in the cookhouse doorway. Present, but not entirely. She had spent 6 weeks learning his edges, and she still found new ones occasionally, small places where his behavior curved away from what she'd predicted. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask," she said. "The day you walked out here from town," he said. 8 miles in July. "You didn't know anything about this place or who ran it or whether there was actually a position available. You just walked." "I knew there was a position available," she said. "I heard it in town." "You heard 2 men talking by a barrel outside the general provisions," he said. "That's not the same as knowing." She considered this. The bread in the oven was doing what it needed to do. She had a few minutes before she needed to attend to it. "I had 43 cents, she said. "I had tried every other possibility in Silver Creek. The alternative to walking 8 miles was sitting in Mrs. Tuttle's boarding house until my money ran out and then having no options at all. She paused. 8 miles seemed preferable. It wasn't just practicality, he said. She looked at him. No, it wasn't. What else was it? She thought about how to answer honestly, which was the only way she wanted to answer. I've been turned away from a lot of things in my life, she said. Most of them I had a right to expect and didn't get. After a while, you start to understand that the turning away is the other person's problem, not yours. It says something about them. It says almost nothing about you. She paused. So I walked, because I had the skill and I had the history, and I knew that if someone just let me into a kitchen and let me do the work would speak for itself. I just needed someone to open the door. The rain was loud on the roof. He was looking at her with the particular quality of attention he sometimes gave her. Not assessment, exactly, though that was part of it. Something more focused than that. That first night, he said, when the men went quiet after the first bite, do you know what I was thinking? I have a guess, she said. Tell me. You were thinking about your wife, she said. The silence that followed was the particular silence of something accurate landing in a place where it wasn't expected. She watched him absorb it. The slight shift in his jaw, the thing that happened behind his eyes. How did you know that? He said. Because you looked at the dining room that night the way a man looks at something he's been missing, she said. Not just good food, the atmosphere of it, people wanting to be in the room. He was quiet for a long moment. The rain came down. Something loose on the cookhouse roof tapped in the wind. Her name was Clara, he said. She died 4 years ago. Fever, in February. It was fast, faster than anyone expected. She was fine in the morning and she was gone in 6 days. He said this with the flatness of a man who has said the facts many times and has controlled them down to something manageable. She was the one who... This place had a quality when she was here, the way it felt when you walked in. I haven't known how to recover that. Mabel said nothing. She let the words sit where he'd put them. I know that sounds... He stopped, started again. I'm not saying you replaced anything. That's not what I mean. I know what you mean, she said. He looked at her. Do you? You mean the ranch came back to life a little, she said. And it surprised you, and you're not entirely sure how to feel about being surprised by it. He held her gaze for a moment that was longer than comfortable and shorter than it might have been. Yes, he said. That's exactly what I mean. The bread needed turning. She went to the oven and turned it, and the conversation settled into the sound of the rain, and they stayed in that silence for a while. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but the silence of people who have said something real and are giving it room. But the Henderson family arrived on a Friday afternoon 2 weeks later, when the foreman's house had been aired and cleaned and stocked with the basics. Not comfortable, exactly, but livable. James Henderson was a lean, quiet man in his late 30s, with the specific quality of stunned endurance that people carry in the weeks after a sudden large loss, when the shock has worn off enough to see the damage clearly, but the resources to address it are still not quite available. His wife, Nora, was younger than Mabel had expected. Mid-30s, dark-haired, with 3 children orbiting around her in the constant low-level motion of young people who have been through something upsetting and are compensating by refusing to be still. The children were 8, 6, and 4. The 4-year-old was a girl named Pearl, who had a serious, watchful face and a habit of standing slightly behind her mother's skirt while examining everything in her field of vision with the thoroughness of a small scientist. Mabel had made the dinner she had been thinking about for 2 weeks. Not elaborate, not impressive in the showy sense, but generous. The kind of meal that said, without anyone having to articulate it, that you were expected and wanted, and there was enough. A large pot of chicken and dumplings that had been going since before noon, the broth built slowly and the dumplings added at the right moment so they were light and just cooked through. Roasted sweet potatoes because the children needed something that would read as a treat without being a production. Fresh bread. Sliced tomatoes from the small kitchen garden she'd started against the south wall of the cookhouse 3 weeks ago, which had not yet fully justified itself but had produced enough tomatoes for this. and for dessert, a peach cobbler, because she had 6 ripe peaches from the supply wagon, and she knew what to do with ripe peaches. The Hendersons sat at the long table with Ethan at one end and Mabel, for the first time since she'd arrived, seated at the other, which Ethan had arranged without discussion by simply setting a place for her and telling Clint to inform her that she was eating with the family tonight. Pearl, the 4-year-old, sat next to Mabel. This had not been planned. Pearl had simply arrived at the bench, looked at the available options, and sat down next to Mabel with the decisive practicality of a small person who knows what she wants. Nora had started to redirect her, and Mabel had said it was perfectly fine, and so Pearl stayed and spent the first 10 minutes of the meal conducting a silent examination of Mabel from a distance of approximately 18 inches. "What are you looking at?" Mabel asked her during a pause in the adult conversation. "You," Pearl said. "I gathered. What do you think?" Pearl considered this with the gravity it apparently deserved. "You're big," she said. "I am," Mabel agreed. "Like a bear," Pearl said, "but a nice bear." Nora Henderson made a strangled sound that might have been mortification. Mabel felt the laugh before she could stop it, a real one, the kind that comes from the chest, not the kind that's performed. She heard Ethan, at the other end of the table, make a sound she'd never heard from him before, a short, genuine laugh that surprised him as much as anyone. "That's the nicest thing anyone said to me in a long time," Mabel told Pearl. Pearl looked satisfied and applied herself to her dumplings. The dinner went well in the way that the Saturday dinner had gone well 2 months earlier, but differently. Not with the careful calculation of a business meal, but with the unself-conscious ease of people who needed to be fed and were being fed properly. James Henderson ate with the single-minded focus of a man who hadn't had a real meal in 2 weeks. Nora, more self-conscious, ate carefully at first and then less carefully as the food kept being good. The older children ate the way children eat good food, entirely, without commentary. After dinner, when the children had been moved to the sitting room and the adults were at the table with the last of the coffee, James Henderson looked at Mabel directly for the first time all evening. "Thank you," he said. "I haven't—" He stopped. The stunned endurance quality was still in his face, but underneath it something had loosened. "Nora cried last week," he said, "about the cookware. We lost it all in the fire, and she said more than anything she missed being able to cook properly, to make something for the children." He looked at his coffee. "I know that sounds small." "It doesn't sound small at all," Mabel said. "I have extra cookware," she said. "Nothing fancy, but functional. Cast iron, a couple of the stock pots. You're welcome to them." Nora looked up sharply. "We couldn't—" "I have more than I need," Mabel said, "and a cast iron skillet is more useful to you than sitting in my storage shelf." Nora pressed her lips together in the way of a woman managing the particular pride of someone who was used to providing and was not used to receiving. Mabel recognized it. She had worn that exact expression herself, more times than she cared to count. "We'd pay you back," Nora said. "When you're able," Mabel said. "No hurry." Pearl appeared at Mabel's elbow at that moment, having apparently concluded that the sitting room was less interesting than the adults. She climbed onto the bench beside Mabel without ceremony and leaned against her arm with the complete unconscious trust of a very small person who has decided something without needing a reason. Nora made a move to retrieve her. Mabel shook her head slightly. She sat there with Pearl leaning against her arm, and the dinner conversation continuing around the table, and felt the particular weight of a child trusting you, the literal physical weight of it, solid and warm, and felt something move in her chest that she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. It was later, after the Hendersons had gone to the foreman's house and the cookhouse was clean and the ranch had settled into its night, that Tom Greer found her in the kitchen garden. She was out there in the dark checking on the tomato plants, which was not strictly necessary and which she was doing because she needed 5 minutes outside. He came around the corner of the cookhouse and stopped when he saw her. "Didn't know anyone was out here," he said. "I'm checking the plants," she said. He looked at the plants, which were invisible in the dark. "In the dark." "I know where they are," she said. He made a sound that was almost a laugh and leaned against the cookhouse wall. She stayed where she was among the plants, crouching slightly, running her fingers along the bottom leaves to check for the slugs that had been appearing since the rain. "That little girl," he said. Pearl, she just sat right down next to you. She did. She did it like she'd known you her whole life. He paused. Kids do that. They don't see the same things adults see when they look at a person. They see something else. What do they see? He thought about it, which she appreciated. She had asked a real question, and he was treating it as one. Whether you're safe, he said. That's all they care about. Everything else, how you look, what people say about you, all of it, none of that reads to them, just whether you're safe. She found a slug and removed it from the leaf in the dark by feel. That child picked you out of a whole room full of people, he said, and she was right. She stood up from the plants. He was looking at her in the way people sometimes look at things they've changed their mind about, with an attention that is slightly uncomfortable because it contains the awareness of what they previously refused to see. Tom, she said. Yeah. Go to bed, she said. We both got work at 5:30. He pushed off the wall. Right. He started toward the bunkhouse and then stopped, half-turned. For what it's worth, and I know it's late, and I know I should have seen it sooner, you're good for this place, not the cooking, all of it. She looked at him in the dark. Go to bed, she said again, but without sharpness. He went. She stayed in the kitchen garden for another few minutes. The night was clear after the earlier week's rain, and the stars over Texas were the particular extravagance they always were. Too many, spread too wide. The kind of sky that made a person feel both small and, paradoxically, less alone. She thought about Pearl leaning against her arm. She thought about Raphael's hand flat on his chest. She thought about Clint reorganizing the shelves without being asked. She thought about Pete Alderman eating his potato soup slowly, in the manner of a man who was in no hurry to leave a good place. She had built something here, not the life she'd had before. She was not trying to rebuild what was gone, had never been trying to do that. Something different, something that was hers in the way things are yours when you've made them from your own materials, with your own hands, in the specific conditions of the life you actually have, rather than the one you used to have or wished you'd had. It was not finished. There was more work ahead than she could see clearly. The land dispute resolution would change the ranch's dynamics in ways she hadn't mapped yet. The Hendersons were in the foreman's house, and that was a new variable in the life of the property. And there was Ethan. The conversation in the cookhouse during the rain, the way he'd said Clara's name, the way he'd looked at her after she'd answered his question accurately. That was the furthest thing from resolved, and she was not going to pretend otherwise to herself. But she was here. She was still here. She found the last slug on the last plant, removed it, and went inside. The formal resolution of the land dispute arrived on a Wednesday morning in late September, delivered by a courier from San Antonio in the form of a sealed document that Howard Fitch had already summarized in a letter sent 3 days prior. The county had ruled in Ethan's favor on all points. The tributary creek and the eastern pasture water rights were confirmed as part of the original Blackwood land grant, exactly as the 1861 survey document specified. Victor Kane had withdrawn his claim entirely rather than pursue a case he could not win. Ethan told the men at breakfast. He didn't make a speech about it. That was not his way. He simply came into the dining room while they were eating and said that the land matter was settled and the eastern pastures were secure, and that was that. The response from the men was the response of people who had been working a piece of land for years and had understood, without being told directly, that the land itself was at risk. There was a particular quality of relief in the room, not loud, not demonstrative, but real, like a held breath finally released. Pete Alderman raised his coffee cup in Ethan's direction. A few of the others nodded. Tom Greer looked at the table for a moment and then looked at Ethan and said simply, "Good," which, from Tom, was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Mabel was at the cookhouse door when Ethan came out of the dining room. Their eyes met briefly. She gave him a single nod, the way you acknowledge something that doesn't require more words than that. He returned it and went on to his work. She went back to the stoves. It was only later, turning the thing over in the back of her mind while she prepped the noon meal, that she understood what the resolution meant for the ranch in practical terms. Secure water rights meant the eastern pastures were fully viable for the long term. Viable pastures meant more cattle. More cattle meant more men, more operations, more everything. A ranch that had been holding itself carefully, not quite expanding, not quite contracting, now had room to move forward. The uncertainty that had sat over Blackwood Ranch like weather for the past year was gone, and what was left was a clear day and a lot of open ground. She thought about what that meant for her own position here, and then she stopped thinking about it, because there was bread to shape, and she had learned not to borrow trouble from the future when the present required her attention. But the trouble came from a different direction than she'd expected, which was usually how trouble arrived. It was the first week of October when a woman named Dorothy Fales drove out from Silver Creek in a buckboard wagon with her 17-year-old daughter, Adelaide, and presented herself at the main house with the specific, purposeful energy of someone who had planned this visit carefully. Mabel was in the kitchen garden when they arrived. The garden had expanded through September, with Clint's help, to include a second raised bed of herbs and a row of late-season greens, and she watched from a distance as Dorothy Fales was welcomed onto the porch by Ethan with the careful courtesy of a man who was not entirely sure what he was welcoming. She learned the context from Clint by midday, because Clint was constitutionally incapable of having information and not eventually conveying it to someone. Dorothy Fales was the widow of a Silver Creek merchant who had died 18 months ago and left his family in comfortable circumstances. She was, by Clint's account, a woman who managed her comfortable circumstances with great deliberateness, and had been managing, with equal deliberateness, the question of her own future for the better part of a year. Ethan Blackwood was a wealthy ranch owner who had been a widower for 4 years. These two facts had apparently been circling each other in the social geometry of Silver Creek for some time, and Dorothy Fales had apparently decided that the circling had gone on long enough. She brought Adelaide, Clint said, with the tone of someone reporting a tactical detail. People say she brings Adelaide everywhere as a softening thing. She's a nice enough girl, Adelaide. Quiet. Mabel listened to all of this while she was trimming the herbs she'd brought in from the garden, and when Clint had finished, she said, "Thank you, Clint," in a tone that indicated the subject was now closed, and he took the hint and moved on to the shelf reorganization she'd asked him to do. She thought about it anyway, because she was honest with herself, and honesty required acknowledging that the information had landed somewhere specific and caused a reaction she needed to examine. What she found, when she examined it, was not jealousy exactly. She was not entitled to jealousy, had never claimed any entitlement of that kind, and she was too old and too practical and had been through too many things to pretend to emotions she hadn't fully earned. What she found was something more complicated, a kind of bracing, the adjustment a person makes when the ground shifts slightly under them and they need to redistribute their weight. She was not going to make anything of it. Whatever happened at the main house was Ethan Blackwood's business, and her job was the cookhouse, and she was going to do her job. She made a very good lunch. Dorothy Fales and Adelaide stayed for lunch, which meant Mabel was asked, through Clint, as Ethan's intermediary, to set 2 additional places at the family table in the dining room and prepare a meal suitable for guests. This was objectively simply a professional request. She treated it as one. She sent back word through Clint that it would be handled, and she handled it. She made a roasted chicken with pan gravy, the late-season greens dressed with apple cider vinegar and a little of the good salt, fresh bread, and the peach preserve she'd put up in August when the peaches had come in quantity. It was a good meal. She knew it was a good meal before she sent it out. She did not go into the dining room. She heard the lunch from the cookhouse, the sounds of it, the voices at a remove, the particular texture of a social meal with guests. Dorothy Fales had a carrying voice, not a loud one, but a voice with projection, the voice of a woman who had spent years in rooms where she needed to be heard. Mabel could not make out words, but she could make out tone, and the tone was warm and engaged and deliberate, the same way Dorothy Fales herself was apparently warm and engaged and deliberate about everything. Adelaide, apparently, said very little. Clint reported this afterward, also, that Adelaide had mostly looked at her plate and answered questions when asked, but hadn't initiated conversation, and that she had eaten everything and then some, which was the best compliment a quiet person could give a cook. Ethan came to the cookhouse that evening at the usual hour. He came in and stood at the work table, and she finished what she was doing before she looked up. "The lunch was excellent," he said. "I know," she said. He was quiet for a moment. She waited to see which way the conversation was going to go. Dorothy Fales is... He stopped. She's a capable woman. She seems it, Mabel said. She came with intentions that I suspect she would describe as practical. Mabel looked at him. His face was doing the management thing, the quality of careful neutrality that he deployed when he was navigating something he hadn't fully decided how to feel about. "And are you interested in her practical intentions?" Mabel said. The directness of the question landed visibly. He looked at her for a moment. "No," he said. "I'm not." She held his gaze. "Then that answers the question." "Does it? Doesn't it?" He looked at the work table. "Dorothy Fales would be a logical choice," he said. "She's respected in town. She's well off. She's..." "Logical," Mabel said. "Yes." "Ethan," she said, which was the first time she had used his first name without thinking about it first. "Are you telling me this because you want my permission, or because you want me to tell you that you don't need a logical choice?" The silence that followed was the longest silence they had ever sat in together, and they had sat in some long ones. Outside, the evening sounds of the ranch, the cattle, the horses, the distant voices of men finishing up their work, came through the walls the way they always did. The lamp was low. The cookhouse was warm. "I don't know what I'm telling you," he said finally. "I came here to talk to you because..." He stopped. "Because I think better in here than anywhere else on this property, and I don't fully understand why." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what was true and what was fair to say, and what was more than she was willing to put on the table at this particular moment, in a conversation that had arrived without sufficient preparation. "You think better in here," she said, "because this is the only room on the property where someone is paying attention to more than the immediate practical problem." He looked at her. "That's not an accident," she said, "and it's not the food, it's a way of being in a space." She paused. "Your wife had that. I can't speak to exactly what form it took for her, but I'd bet that's what you're missing, and I'd bet that's what Dorothy Fales, capable as she is, doesn't offer." The silence again. But different this time. Not the silence of someone managing, but the silence of someone who has just heard a thing that rearranged something. "Mabel," he said. "Don't," she said. Not harshly, firmly. "Don't say whatever you're about to say tonight. We've been circling something for 2 months, and I'd rather we do this when we know what we're circling, not because a widow from Silver Creek showed up with her daughter and made the question feel urgent." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You're right," in the tone of a man who means it entirely and finds that both a relief and a complication. "I usually am," she said. "Go to bed." He almost smiled. The corner of his mouth moved in the way she had learned meant the same thing as a full smile from anyone else. "Good night, Mabel," he said. "Good night," she said. He left. She stood in the cookhouse for a while afterward, not doing anything, just standing. Her heart was moving at a slightly unusual rate, which she acknowledged and then set aside, because it was not actionable information at the present moment. She turned down the lamp and went to bed. Dorothy Fales came back once more 2 weeks later, and that time Mabel did meet her. It happened in the yard, accidentally. Mabel coming from the kitchen garden with a basket of late greens and Dorothy approaching from the direction of the main house where she'd been visiting with Ethan. They met at the corner of the cookhouse in the way of two people whose paths converge at a point neither planned. Dorothy Fales was a handsome woman in her early 40s, well-dressed in the way of someone who understood that appearance communicated information and was deliberate about what information she wanted to communicate. She looked at Mabel with the directness of someone who had already formed a view and was confirming it. "You're the cook," Dorothy said. "I am?" Mabel said. "I had your lunch 2 weeks ago, the chicken." "I remember." Dorothy looked at her for a moment, a real look, the assessing kind that didn't pretend to be something else. "You're not just the cook," she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation stated plainly by a woman who had spent enough time in the world to know the difference between someone who held a position and someone who held a place. "I do the cooking," Mabel said. Dorothy looked at the basket of greens. She looked at the kitchen garden beyond. She looked at the cookhouse with its new door on the south wall, and its widened shelving visible through the open window. She looked back at Mabel. "He had that door put in," Dorothy said. "And the shelving." "The ventilation needed improving," Mabel said. "Men don't improve ventilation for people they consider replaceable," Dorothy said. Mabel said nothing. Dorothy Fales was quiet for a moment. She had the quality of a woman who didn't require the last word, which Mabel respected. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped the edge of assessment and become something more straightforward. "He's a good man," she said. "I'm practical enough to know when something I wanted isn't available." She paused. "I came because Silver Creek expects it. The logistics of widowhood in a small town, everyone calculating, everyone watching. I thought perhaps he was the practical solution." Another pause. "He's not. And I knew that before I drove out the second time, if I'm honest with myself. I came back to confirm it." Mabel looked at her steadily. "You confirmed it," she said. "I did," Dorothy said. A slight smile, dry and self-aware, moved across her face. "The chicken was very good." "Thank you," Mabel said. Dorothy Fales drove back to Silver Creek that afternoon and did not come back a third time. Well, November arrived with a sharpness in the air that the Texas summer made you forget was possible. The ranch shifted into its autumn rhythms. The cattle drives that took the men out for days at a time. The reduction in the daily head count at meals. The particular quality of the cookhouse in cold weather, with the stoves running at full capacity, which made it the warmest room on the property by a significant margin. The Hendersons had settled into the foreman's house with a completeness that had surprised everyone, including probably themselves. James Henderson had repaid the loan of the cookware by the middle of October, not in money, but in labor, 3 consecutive Saturdays helping to extend the kitchen garden's winter bed preparation, which had worked out better for everyone than cash would have. Nora Henderson had turned out to be a woman who expressed gratitude through reciprocity rather than words, which Mabel found straightforward and comfortable. Pearl came to the cookhouse twice a week. This had not been formally arranged. It had simply happened. Pearl had appeared one morning in the cookhouse doorway the way small children appear in places, without preamble or explanation, and climbed onto the 3-legged stool near the cold stove and watched Mabel work with the absolute focused attention of someone learning something. Mabel had asked her, the second time, whether her mother knew she was there. Pearl had said yes in the tone of a child who understood that yes was the correct answer. Mabel had looked at her for a moment and then handed her a piece of bread dough to knead, and the arrangement had proceeded from there. Pearl was a terrible bread kneader. She was 4 years old. Her small hands lacked the leverage, and her attention wandered after about 90 seconds, and she had a tendency to press her thumb into the dough and inspect the impression rather than continuing the work. But she was present and curious, and occasionally said things that stopped Mabel in her tracks. "Why do you cook so much?" Pearl asked one morning, with the directness of someone who had been saving this question. "Because there are a lot of people to feed," Mabel said. "But you cook more than you have to," Pearl said. "Mama says so. She says you make more than you need to." Mabel thought about this. "Your mama's right," she said. "I do." "Why?" She looked at the small, serious face on the stool. She thought about how to answer honestly in a way that a 4-year-old could hold. "Because extra is how you tell people they matter," she said. "When you make just enough, it means you calculated how much they needed. When you make more than enough, it means you weren't thinking about the minimum. You were thinking about them." Pearl processed this. "So the extra food is like—" She frowned, reaching for it. "Like a hug?" Mabel stopped what she was doing and looked at her. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly what it is." Pearl nodded, satisfied, and went back to the bread dough. It was on an evening in late November, 3.5 months after Mabel had walked through the brutal July heat to arrive at this ranch with 43 cents and a worn leather bag, that Ethan Blackwood finally said the thing he'd been moving toward saying for a long time. The day had been long. A cold front had come through in the afternoon, dropping the temperature by 20 degrees in an hour, and the men had all come in early and eaten supper in the dense steam and noise atmosphere of very cold people occupying a warm room. The meal had been the beef stew she'd been planning since morning, heavy with root vegetables and the good bone broth she kept going on the back of the left stove, with the biscuits that Tom Greer still would not openly compliment, but which he ate with a consistency that constituted a different kind of praise. It had been a good meal for a cold night, and the room had had the quality she always tried to create. Not quite celebration, not quite ceremony, just the ordinary but unreplicable feeling of being somewhere warm with enough to eat and people you knew around you. After the men had gone to the bunkhouse and the kitchen was clean and the stoves banked for the night, Ethan came in. He came in and stood at the work table, and she was drying the last of the pots, and he didn't say anything immediately, and she let the silence do what it needed to do. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said. "I've been trying to find the right way to say it for a while," he said. "I don't think there's a right way, so I'm going to say it plainly, and you can tell me if I've got the reading of this situation wrong." She set the pot down and turned to face him. He was looking at her in the way he had that wasn't performance. Straight, without the management layer on top of it. The face of a man who had decided to stop being careful and wasn't entirely comfortable with that decision, but was making it anyway. "I'd like you to stay," he said. "Not as the cook. Or, not only as the cook. I'd like you to stay as more than that, if that's something you'd consider." The room was quiet. The cold outside pressed against the walls, and the stoves kept the interior warm, and the lamp threw its usual circle of light, and the rest of the cookhouse sat in comfortable shadow. "I'm already staying," she said. "You offered me the position, and I took it." "That's not what I mean," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm making you say it." Something moved through his expression, not quite exasperation, but the close relative of it. "Mabel." "Ethan," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to make this permanent, in the full sense of the word. Not a cook's position, a life." She had known this was coming. She had known it the way you know weather is coming. Not the exact moment, but the direction and the inevitability. She had thought about how she would respond when it came, and what she had decided was that she would respond honestly, which for her meant not quickly. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She sat across from him at the work table, and they faced each other across the scarred wooden surface with the lamp between them. "I'm going to tell you something," she said, "and I want you to listen to all of it before you say anything." He nodded. "I came here with nothing," she said, "and I don't mean that as a bid for sympathy. I mean it as a fact that's relevant to what I'm about to say. I had 43 cents and a bag and a photograph and a set of skills that nobody in Silver Creek had bothered to see yet. I had also been told, in one form or another, by enough people over enough years, that I was not what anyone was looking for." She paused. "Not because of anything I did or failed to do. Because of how I looked. Because I was a large woman who didn't fit the picture that people had in their heads of what a woman worth keeping should look like." He was looking at her without interrupting. "Good. I have built something here," she said. "Something real. Not because anyone gave it to me, because I came in and I did the work, and I paid attention, and I showed up every morning at 4:15, and I took this place seriously. The men trust me. The kitchen runs well. Pearl comes twice a week and learns to ruin bread dough, and I wouldn't trade that for anything." She stopped. "I'm telling you this because I need you to understand that what I have here, I built. It belongs to me in the way things belong to you when you've made them yourself." "I know that," he said. "I've known that since the first week." "Then you understand that I'm not going to enter into something just because it's offered," she said. "I've been undervalued long enough to know my own worth. If I say yes to you, it has to be because I mean it, not because you're a wealthy man with a good ranch and it would be the practical solution." He looked at her. "Is that what you think I'm offering? A practical solution?" "No," she said. "I don't. But I want to have said it." "Then say what you actually think," he said. "What I'm offering." She looked at him across the lamp, at the face she had spent 3.5 months learning, the controlled exterior, the thing that moved behind his eyes when something got through the control, the way he turned his hat in his hands when he had something difficult to say, the laugh that had surprised him as much as Pearl's bear comment had surprised everyone else, the way he had sat in this room during the rain and said Clara's name with the flat precision of a man who has learned to carry something by keeping it very still. "I think you're offering something real," she said. I think you are a man who has been alone in a particular way for 4 years, and who has, in the last several months, found that he is less alone, and who would like that to be a permanent state of affairs. Yes, he said, that's accurate. And I think, she said, that you see me, not the version of me that's useful. Me. She paused. Which is rarer than it should be. I see you, he said. I have since the first night. She believed him. That was the thing. She had spent enough years around people who didn't see her to know accurately what it felt like when someone did, and Ethan Blackwood had been seeing her with a thoroughness and consistency that she had stopped arguing with around the 4th week. All right, she said. He looked at her. All right? Yes, she said. My answer is yes, but I have conditions. The corner of his mouth moved. You always have conditions. The cookhouse remains mine, she said. My kitchen, my authority, my decisions. That doesn't change. Agreed. The Vega brothers stay. I don't care what changes on this ranch. Those men have been here and done good work, and they stay. They were never at risk of leaving, he said, but agreed. And Pearl Henderson can come to the cookhouse whenever she wants, she said. She is 4 years old and she is learning to make bread, and I will not have that interrupted. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had not seen from him before, something open in it, something that had let the management layer drop entirely, and what was under it was a man who was, against his own expectations, happy. Not the uncomplicated happiness of people who have not been through much, the complicated happiness of people who have been through things and have arrived, despite all of it, at something good. Pearl Henderson can come whenever she wants, he said. Then yes, Mabel said. My answer is yes. They were married in December, simply, in the way of people who have no interest in ceremony for its own sake, and every interest in the thing the ceremony is supposed to represent. Howard Fitch, who turned out to be a justice of the peace in addition to a land rights attorney, came up from San Antonio. The Hendersons were there. Pete Alderman stood at the back of the room with the careful stillness of a man who is moved and would prefer not to show it, and was showing it anyway. Tom Greer wore his cleanest shirt and said nothing objectionable for the entire duration of the event, which Mabel counted as a wedding gift. Rafael and Domingo Vega were present, and Domingo's arm had healed clean, and when it was done, Rafael pressed Mabel's hand briefly and said something in Spanish that she didn't fully catch, but understood in the way you understand certain things without needing the words. Clint cried. He tried to hide it and failed, and then looked so mortified about it that Mabel, on her way past him, put her hand briefly on his shoulder, and he straightened up and regained himself. Pearl, who had been told something was happening but had not been told specifically what, sat through the brief proceedings with her customary serious attention, and afterward came to stand next to Mabel and took hold of 2 of Mabel's fingers with her small hand and stood there. Just stood there. Mabel looked down at her. Pearl looked straight ahead. That was all. But it was everything. The spring that followed was different from the summer Mabel had arrived in, the way that springs are different from summers. Not just in temperature, but in possibility, the sense of things opening rather than pressing down. The ranch expanded, as she had anticipated it would once the land dispute was resolved. 2 more hands hired by March. The eastern pastures stocked properly for the first time in 3 years. A new storage building behind the cookhouse that doubled her cold cellar capacity, which she had specified the dimensions of herself and which Ethan had built to those specifications without modification. Silver Creek's relationship to Mabel Rosewood, who was now Mabel Blackwood, though she used both names depending on context, as she pleased, shifted in the way that small towns shift when someone they dismiss turns out to matter. It was not immediate, and it was not comfortable. Gerald Pruitt, who had told her she'd eat through his profits, found himself doing supply business with Blackwood Ranch and dealing with Mabel as the purchasing authority, because Ethan had ceded the supply decisions entirely to her. Their interactions were professional. She was not interested in making him feel bad about what he'd said. She was interested in getting the right order at the right price, and she was better at that than he was at anything, so it worked out. Mrs. Calloway from the hotel had come out to the ranch in February for reasons she described as neighborly and which were almost certainly investigative. She had eaten lunch. Mabel's winter vegetable soup with the cream stirred in at the end, and the dark bread she'd been perfecting since October, and had said, on her way out, that this was the finest meal she'd had outside of San Antonio. Mabel had thanked her. She meant it. She was past the point of calculating whether a compliment was deserved based on whether the person delivering it had previously deserved her goodwill. That was something she had learned. One of the things. One of many. That keeping accounts of who had wronged you required energy she needed for other things. That the people who had looked at her and seen less than was there were limited by their own vision, not by anything in her. That the cost of their limitation was theirs to carry, and she was not required to carry it alongside them. It was Tom Greer who said it, on a morning in April. He came into the cookhouse for the first time in the months since Mabel had been there, not to the dining room where he ate every day, but into the kitchen itself, which was her domain and which he had always respected as such. He came in and stood near the door with his hat in his hands, which she had come to understand as the universal posture of men on this ranch, who were about to say something that cost them. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. She was at the stove. She turned the heat down slightly so she could give him part of her attention. "Go ahead." "When you first came," he said. "What I said. I've apologized for it, and I'm not going to apologize again because I think doing it more than once starts to be about me rather than about the thing I did." He paused. "But I want you to know that I was wrong in a way that was specifically stupid, not general stupidity, specific." She looked at him. "I looked at you, and I saw someone who was going to fail," he said. "And I saw that because I had decided you were going to fail before you'd done anything. I told myself it was experience, that I'd seen a lot of people come through here, and I knew the type. But I didn't know your type. I'd never met your type." He stopped. "What I saw was something I'd decided to see, and that's different." She considered what was in front of her. Tom Greer was a man in his mid-40s who had been building his walls since before she'd arrived, and was, in this moment, being intentional about the few he was willing to take down. She was not going to be careless with that. "I know," she said. "I was wrong," he said. "And you were right. Letting the work speak was the right move. You didn't need me to come around. You just did what you did and let me get there on my own." He paused. "I respect that. It would have been easy to push back, and you didn't." "Pushing back would have cost more than it was worth," she said. "I've spent energy pushing against things that weren't going to move. I've learned to tell the difference between a wall and a door." He looked at her. "Which was I?" "A door," she said. "Just a slow one." Something in his face moved. That same almost smile she'd catalogued in the first weeks, except this time it got all the way there. A real smile, brief but actual, the kind a person produces when they've been surprised by something that feels good. "Fair enough," he said. He put his hat back on. "Breakfast was good this morning." "It always is," she said. He left. She turned the heat back up and went back to work. Oh, there's a thing that people get wrong about resilience, which is that they imagine it as a quality, something some people have and others don't, an innate armor that the strong are born with, and the rest of the world struggles to find. Mabel Rosewood had not been born with armor. She had been born with a mother who cooked with attention and precision and love, and who had taught her daughter that the way you did a thing mattered as much as whether you did it. She had been born into a life that was warm and specific, and then had that life taken from her in fire and grief and the slow accumulating damage of being told over and over by the world's lesser representatives that she was not enough and never would be. What she had built from that was not armor. It was something harder to acquire and more useful to have. The understanding that other people's inability to see you was a failure of their vision, not an absence in yourself. That the work was the proof. That showing up was the argument. That the best response to someone who said you couldn't do the thing was to do the thing, and then let them do the mathematics themselves, and then move on to the next thing without waiting for their conclusion. She had not set out to save a ranch. She had set out to find a job because she had 43 cents and needed to eat and had skills she believed in. The saving had been a consequence of showing up fully every day with everything she had, Not because she was performing for an audience, not because she was trying to prove something to the people who had dismissed her, but because it was her work, and her work mattered, and the people who ate at her table deserved to have someone who understood that. The women who came through Silver Creek that year, and the year after, women looking for positions, women starting over, women carrying the weight of being looked at before they were seen. Some of them made their way to Blackwood Ranch, because word traveled the way word always traveled in small frontier towns, through the invisible channels of daily life. Some of them needed work. Some of them needed something harder to name. Mabel fed them, all of them. She gave them what she could and connected them with what she couldn't provide herself. She did not make speeches about it. She just did it the way she did everything, with attention and without ceremony. Ethan, watching this one evening from the porch, said, "You've turned the cookhouse into something else." "The cookhouse was always something else," she said. "I just made it visible." He looked at her with the open expression she still was not entirely accustomed to, because she had spent most of her life around people who kept their faces carefully managed, and Ethan Blackwood, in private, had stopped managing his face where she was concerned. "You know what they say about you in town," he said. "I've heard some of it," she said. "They say you're the one who turned the ranch around," he said. "That whatever Blackwood Ranch is now, it's because of you." She thought about this. "That's not quite right," she said. "The ranch turned around because the water rights were secured and you hired good men and you made good decisions about the land." She paused. "What I did was keep the table, make it a place people wanted to come back to. That's not turning a ranch around, that's keeping the fire going so the other things have something to warm themselves by." He was quiet for a moment. "You could take more credit than that." "I could," she said. "But credit doesn't interest me much. What interests me is whether it's right." She looked out at the darkening property, the land that was now hers as much as anyone's, not by legal right initially, but by the deeper right of being the person who showed up for it. "It's right. That's enough." Pearl appeared between them at that moment, materializing from the direction of the kitchen garden where she had been doing something investigative among the herbs, and inserted herself into the space between the adults with her usual decisive irrelevance to what anyone else was doing. "The mint is spreading," she announced, "into the oregano." "I know," Mabel said. "I need to put a barrier in." "I could help," Pearl said. "Tomorrow morning," Mabel said. "Before breakfast." Pearl accepted this with the gravity of someone being entrusted with real work, because she was, and went back toward the foreman's house in the last of the evening light. Ethan watched her go. "She's going to be a remarkable person," he said. "She already is," Mabel said. They stood on the porch as the dark came in. The two of them, and the ranch around them made its familiar evening sounds. The cattle, the horses, the men in the bunkhouse, the distant creek that was now legally and permanently Blackwood water running in its ordinary way over its ordinary stones. The stars came out in their extravagant Texas abundance, too many to count, spread across the sky with the generosity of something that had never been told to hold back. Mabel thought about her mother. She thought about the restaurant on Chartres Street and the smell of Sunday mornings before service and the motion of her mother's hands in the bread dough. She thought about the fire and the ash and the 8 years of walking through one closed door after another and the specific cruelty of the man with the ledger who hadn't looked up when he said what he said. She thought about the 8 miles of July heat and the smell of the ranch before she saw it, and the first dinner, and the sound of 22 men going quiet all at once. She thought about Pearl's hand flat on her chest and Raphael's hand flat on his, and the particular weight of a 4-year-old leaning against your arm. The life she was living now was not the one she had been building when the fire came. It was not the one she would have chosen if she'd been given the choosing at 26 in the restaurant on Chartres Street with her mother still alive and everything still intact. She would have chosen that one. She would have chosen it without hesitation. But she had not been given the choosing. She had been given the fire and the loss and the years of walking and 43 cents and a leather bag and the skills her mother had put in her hands before she was old enough to understand what she was being given. And she had carried all of it through every door that opened and through several that didn't. And she had arrived here, in this specific life, in this specific place, with these specific people at her table. And the table was good. The table was real. That was not a small thing. In Mabel's experience, it was the only thing that ever finally mattered. Not what you'd lost, not what had been taken, not what the world had decided about you before you'd had a chance to speak. What mattered was whether you had built something true, whether the people at your table were there because they wanted to be, whether the fire in the stove was lit by someone who understood why it needed to stay lit. She had understood it her whole life. She had simply needed someone to let her into the kitchen. Ethan put his hand next to hers on the porch railing, not over it, next to it. She looked down at their hands side by side on the weathered wood, and then she looked out at the stars, and she let the evening do what evenings do when you have stopped fighting them. When you have learned, finally, to be in the place you are rather than reaching for the place you came from or fearing the place ahead. She was here. She had built this. It was hers. The cookhouse would be warm in the morning. The fire would be lit at 4:15, the same as always. The bread would rise and the coffee would go on the stove, and the men would come in from the cold, and Pearl would appear in the doorway with dirt on her hands and something investigative to report about the garden. And the day would become what days become when someone has decided to take them seriously. She had 43 cents once, and a worn leather bag, and a life's worth of skills nobody had bothered to look at. She had looked at them herself. She had decided they were enough. She had been right.